Thank you all for staying on. I guess we're standing in the way of lunch, but it's awful out there. It's lightning, raining. It's really awful. You're much better off in the basement. Actually, I have no idea, but I do know who I am. I'm Alan Rawl, lead global coordinator of Sidley Austin's Privacy, Data Security, Information Law group, and as maybe a relevant data point, also previously vice chairman of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. We're going to try to make this a highly interactive amongst the panel, I hope, and the audience feel free to interject at any time. Just don't throw your water bottles unless absolutely necessary. We're also going to try to be, or at least I'm going to try to be a little controversial, so the remarks that I make or others make may or may not represent even their own true views or mine. But we do have a dream team here, a cybersecurity brain trust. If this group can't solve all of these problems, everybody get off the grid and go dark right now. This is a group from the White House, Michael Daniel, Homeland Security, from Suzanne Spalding of the National Protection Directorate. I love that name. Julie Brill, FTC Commissioner. Craig Silliman from a leading ISP at Verizon. And Nick Rossi from the senior staffer for the relevant Committee of Jurisdiction, the Senate Commerce Committee. So again, we have got really the dream team here for you. And this could not be a more topical subject, cybersecurity, targeting a secure future. Of course, it's topical every day. We could have this conference every day for several years, and it would be topical. But of course, it's particularly, today I didn't see any major news of hacking or data breaches in the newspapers. Maybe I didn't read them closely enough. But I did see in the Wall Street Journal, hacking victims become federal targets is one of their editorials, and we may have occasion to come back to that. But as you've seen in the McAfee report and other reports, there are discussions about claims of $1 trillion losses to the economy from cyber attacks, or maybe $250 billion a year of losses each year to American companies. And President Obama has described cyber security or insecurity as perhaps the greatest threat to American prosperity of the century. So what we're going to do first is kind of have a lightning round, and then I'm going to propound what I hope are some perhaps controversial propositions that the panelists can then react to in questions that I'll direct to each of them, and of course allow other panelists to respond as well. But first we're going to go down the panel and ask them very briefly if they'd like to add anything to my description of their dream team brain trust status regarding their current responsibilities. And if a lot of you are experts, maybe everyone on cybersecurity, and I've asked the panel to either share with us a surprising fact about cybersecurity that not all of us may necessarily know, or perhaps, if they can think of one, a piece of good news. So with that, I'll start with Michael Daniel of the White House.
Sure. Well, thank you, Alan. I would actually say that to describe my role, I'm the chief cat herder for cybersecurity in the federal government. My job is to try to coordinate policy across all the different aspects of the federal government. I would say the surprising thing is that despite being in this job for 2.5 years, I'm still an optimist. I believe that cybersecurity is a really hard problem. It's a really thorny problem, but it's not an insoluble problem. So I think that's actually something that surprises a lot of people when I talk about it.
So I am the Undersecretary, as Alan said, for something called the National Protection and Programs Directorate. And he may love that name, but I don't, because I think it tells you nothing really about what we do. So I will tell you, our overarching and primary mission is to strengthen the security and the resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure. And we do that across all the threats that come after critical infrastructure, including cyber threats and physical threats, whether from natural extreme weather events or terrorist or sabotage events, et cetera, across the board. And we do that in a whole of DHS. We got a lot of parts of the Department of Homeland Security that that have a role in that. We do that in a whole of government approach. There are sector-specific agencies for each of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and we are the sector-specific agency for 10, but for example, DOE is the sector-specific agency for energy, et cetera. We work very closely with those folks, and we do it in a whole-of-nation approach, which is to say with our stakeholders at state, local, territorial, and tribal governments, but also in the private sector. And you're probably all familiar with the statistic that we've been using for a couple decades now about how 85% of the critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. Not sure where that came from, but nobody has successfully challenged it yet. It's at least that number. And so we work very much in collaboration with all of those players to strengthen the security and resilience of critical infrastructure. Cyber is a particularly important focus of that effort, especially today. And again, we've got parts of DHS, the Secret Service, that bring their law enforcement expertise in addition to their protective mission to bear there. Excuse me. We have ICE, Homeland Security Investigation, that also brings a law enforcement piece, intelligence and analysis that brings the intelligence piece. U.S. Coast Guard has a piece of cybersecurity. Our CIO office has a very important role to play in cybersecurity, both at DHS and assisting us with CIOs across the government. We work in very close collaboration with our privacy folks and with our Civil Rights and Civil Liberty Office. They are essential parts of our team because the coin of the realm for the Department of Homeland Security in cybersecurity is that relationship of trust with our private sector partners. And our privacy folks are a critical part of maintaining that trust of the American people and of the private sector, and of making sure that our efforts are appropriately targeted and focused. The piece of good news that I would put out there is that we are actually have developed very strong capabilities and strong trusted relationships. And we see that most profoundly in our Ops Center, our NCIC, our National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, which is a 24/7 Ops Center. It manages our U.S. CERT, our U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, and our ICS CERT, which focuses on industrial control systems. Since they were created in 2009, they have responded to over 500,000 incident reports that have come into the NCIC. They have put out over 26,000 actionable alerts to their private sector and government stakeholders to help improve cybersecurity across the board there. We have reduced the time it takes to get threat information out from weeks to days to hours, and we are working to move it to milliseconds as appropriate by developing automated language templates and ways of transferring the information, sticks and taxi. So that's a bit of good news, and I will steal maybe some of Nick's thunder by another piece of good news, which is that Congress, amazingly, has actually adopted some legislation to advance the ball here. Not enacted yet, but on a bipartisan basis in both the House and Senate committees, we've seen legislation enacted. So a couple pieces of good news.
Julie?
So I'm Julie Brill. I'm a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission, and I think we were asked to give a brief background on who we are and then a bit of good news or surprising news. So just very briefly, I spent over 20 years doing consumer protection and competition enforcement work at the state level before I became a commissioner. And as part of that activity, I led the state's working group on privacy, which also focused on data security. And I guess I should say I was sort of a little surprised to hear on the last panel someone mention that privacy is different from data security or not quite the same. I actually, they're obviously different in some ways, but I actually look at privacy and data security as two sides of the same coin. I don't think consumers can have privacy without data security in particular. So I have had a long background in this area, working at all different levels. I've now been a commissioner for a little bit over 4 years. And a brief background on what the FTC does. I think most everybody here, at least in this room, knows that the FTC has become, in effect, the national enforcement agency dealing with data security, also dealing with privacy, but since we're focused on data security, I'll stick with that for now. We use our Section 5 authority. We use other bits of authority from the GLB safeguards rules and elsewhere, but primarily we're using our Section 5 authority. And I think it's important to note, do not bring actions in order to encourage companies to engage in perfect data security. Our standard is, has a company engaged in reasonable data security? And I think that's really important to keep in mind as this conversation goes forward. We will bring actions when we see systemic failures. We're not, or for instance, someone not patching a known vulnerability. That's going to be kind of your typical example of when we will go after a company in terms of bringing an actual enforcement action. To date, we've had 53 enforcement actions dealing with data security. The latest one involved Snapchat, which was announced in May. I think the bit of good news that I'd like to bring, though, is we as an agency examine hundreds of data breaches. That is, the activities of hundreds of companies that have suffered from a data breach. To date, as I mentioned, we've only brought 53 cases. A data breach does not mean, and I should say, a company that experiences a data breach will not necessarily face an FTC enforcement action. They may not even hear from us, or they may, after responding to some questions and giving us some information, we very well may say, as we have done in the vast majority of cases, okay, you had a reasonable process. Because we realize that stuff happens in this space, and you can't protect from everything. Again, we're not looking for perfect security. But with respect to those companies that didn't engage in very reasonable practices, didn't patch known vulnerabilities, and that engaged in other activities that really fell below the reasonableness line, that's where we take action. So I think the bit of good news is hundreds of companies have come before us, and we have not brought an action.
Craig?
Right. Thanks, Ellen. So as Ellen mentioned, Verizon, of course, one of the largest ISPs around the world. We run one of the world's largest internet backbones. We are embedded in the NKIC that Suzanne mentioned before. One of the other areas that we're heavily involved in that a lot of people don't realize is in cybersecurity forensics. We acquired a company a couple of years ago that does forensics on many of the most significant data breaches we've seen. We don't name our customers, but we are involved in doing forensics on a lot of these major breaches. We also, for those who follow this space, will be familiar with the Data Breach Investigations Report that Verizon puts out every year in conjunction with 50 different organizations around the world, including the Secret Service, that compiles data about cybersecurity issues around the world. In the 2014 report, I want to just pull out a few kind of stats and figures that I think are interesting and illustrative. We went back this year and looked at over 100,000 cyber incidents over the last 10 years. Very, very significant data set. And what we found is that in 92% of those cases, the incidents fall within one of 9 identifiable categories, right? So we sometimes look at this as this vast area of different cybersecurity activity, but in fact, in 92% of these over 100,000 incidents, you could categorize them in one of 9 different cases. There are things like DOS attacks, crimeware, point of sale intrusions, physical theft, etc. One of the things that's interesting, I think if most people, again, who followed this area, at least at a superficial level, would say 2013, or at least the last 18 months, was the year of the point of sale attack, right? There have been some very high profile point of sale intrusion cases. But in fact, if you look at the stats, point of sale intrusions are actually down in 2013 and early 2014 from what they were in 2010 and 2011. So again, one of these things I think we know, but it's helpful to be reminded that what's in the news is not always indicative of underlying trend lines and what we need to be most worried about. The final thing, though, I'll note is that I said that the 92% of these incidents fall into one of 9 discrete categories. Depending on who you are, your major threat isn't the same. So if you're in the hospitality industry, 75% of the cyber incidents we've seen over the last 10 years have been point of sale intrusions, 75%. Utilities, on the other hand, have seen over 70% of their attacks fall in either web app vulnerabilities or crimeware. If you look at healthcare, none of those three I've just mentioned actually fall anywhere in the top three. In fact, over 70% of the incidents in the healthcare industry have either come from physical theft or loss, miscellaneous errors, mean essentially someone accidentally emailed, say, a file to someone who shouldn't have received it, or from insider misuse of information. So when you begin to look at this, I think the lesson you take away is, one, this vast area of activity is not as undefined as it sometimes seems. You can actually begin to drill down and say, we're seeing very discrete areas of activity. Two, that activity isn't the same for everyone. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. You need to think about this differently depending on what your industry and what your characteristics are. And three, the headlines that we see don't always tell the whole story about what you really need to be worried about in this space.
Thanks. Nick?
Thank you. And background, I have taken the somewhat unorthodox or non-traditional path to my current assignment on the Hill. I'm a lawyer by training, which is not that unusual on the Hill, but I spent 11 years with the FBI as a special agent before being loaned to the Hill, and then I got the bug. So I've now been on the Hill, including my detail time, for about 10 years. And about half of that, I would say, has been spent working on issues related to cybersecurity. About 4 or 5 years ago, Senator Rockefeller and Senator Snowe worked together to try to move a cybersecurity bill through the Commerce Committee in the Senate. At the time, I was working for Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, who was then the ranking member of the committee. I then went over to work for Senator Susan Collins of Maine, who labored hard with Senator Joe Lieberman to get a bill to the Senate floor in the last Congress, although we were unable to muster the votes to get cloture. And then this Congress, I have been working for Senator John Thune, who is the ranking member of the Senate Commerce Committee. I guess the bit of good news, and Suzanne did steal my thunder a little bit, but the bit of good news that perhaps has gone underreported or underappreciated is that in the Senate, this Congress, we now have 5 discrete bills that have cleared 3 different committees of jurisdiction, all sponsored by the chairman and ranking member of the respective committees, and all supported by a bipartisan majority of those committees. So we've got 5 bills in the Senate, and nearly all of them have parallel bills in the House that could be relatively easily conferenced with them. So I take that as a definite sign of momentum and progress. And so I too am an optimist that if not this year, then early next year, that actually we may finally see some resolution of the long-standing efforts of the Congress to come to grips with this issue.
Thanks, Nick, and to the panel. The panel was given the option of either providing a surprising fact or a piece of good news. We've heard a lot of good news here that I think many of us might think are also surprising facts. Just a kind of a in-process summary here. We've learned that cybersecurity is not an insoluble problem. DHS has strong relationships with the private sector, that Congress is part of the solution, not the problem, that you can't necessarily believe the news that you read in the media about what the real and growing problems are on cybersecurity, and that there's bipartisan action, at least in the Senate, on cybersecurity. And I think that sets the stage very nicely, and maybe now we're done. But I did want to propound, as I said, some controversial propositions that perhaps in the questions then that we'll go through with the panel, they can react to for or against, or perhaps there'll be some reaction from the audience. So the first is, really no one is safe right now. The Department of Defense has been hacked repeatedly. The State Department has been hacked. The Commerce Department, including in the Bureau that keeps information under the Defense Production Act and national security items. The CIA has been hacked. The Office of Personnel Management's National Security Clearance database has been hacked. I love this one. NASA has been hacked, apparently by mistake. The foreign hackers conflated NASA with NSA, interesting problem. FAA has been hacked. Federal courts have been hacked. The Air Force has been hacked. All of the services. I haven't found a Coast Guard hack, but I think everybody else. The unmanned aerial vehicle, the drone database, Creech Air Force Base, they've been hacked, and their data feed, sort of like TrendNet Baby Monitor, their data video feed was hacked. Army Corps of Engineers, National Dams database, Navy, Veteran Affairs, Department of Energy, SEC, IRS, FTC, as mentioned in the editorial today, was hacked twice, 2012, 2009. Even the actual NSA was hacked by an insider threat. Congressional offices have been hacked. And of course, notwithstanding Craig's comment about not necessarily believing what you read in the newspapers about cybersecurity, even the New York Times has been hacked. So now we know it's a real problem. So that's one proposition. You know what? I don't think anybody, that's not controversial really. But maybe controversial here is that most of these government agencies that have been hacked and the private companies that have been hacked have really, in fact, been trying very hard to safeguard their information networks. And they have strong incentives today to do so. Next proposition, that there isn't much you can do, notwithstanding the solubility of this problem, that right now, many of the major hacks that we hear about use zero-day exploits or malware that's so customized and so sophisticated that if you read what the FBI and the Secret Service have said in their public reports or reports produced on behalf of them, the relevant security gaps or holes couldn't have been reasonably detected or prevented. So that may be controversial. Another one, that there's a diffusion of governmental cybersecurity responsibility, and that we have a proliferation of overlapping security standards and safeguards, and that all of this isn't necessarily helpful, and maybe even getting in the way. We have representatives here from the White House, DHS, FTC, Congress. These are the leading players, and if Tom Clancy writes another novel about cyber warfare and cyber attacks, these will, posthumously by the way, these will be the players who are in the novel, and hopefully they'll get to play themselves in the movie. But again, there are others. So banking agencies, the FIFEC, Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, has got standards, everywhere for banks on cybersecurity. The Securities and Exchange Commission not only has guidance on when you put out disclosures for companies as well as regulating broker-dealers within their ambit, but is now conducting investigations into data breaches as to whether presumably the information was disclosed early enough or internal controls were adequate. States, Julie mentioned that she had responsibility in state attorney general's offices when she was there. Massachusetts has a very detailed set of standards. Anyway, FCC has standards, DOD, energy agencies. How many of these? So diffusion and overlapping standards, more isn't necessarily better here. Is that Mies van der Rohe? Anyway, another proposition, that cybercrime is sort of like real crime. And what does the public count on to protect itself from real crime? Well, it counts on the government to take the responsibility for protecting the targets of crime, rather than blaming the victims, who are the victims of intentional wrongdoing by other parties. That really is, to some extent, the theme of today's Wall Street Journal editorial. And that while it's true that some victims of crime may not follow minimally acceptable practices, and they should be investigated and should be encouraged through sanctions or otherwise to do the right thing. Query, if the NSA's secrets had been consumer data rather than the most highly classified information that the country possesses, would the FTC have felt compelled to go after the NSA for its rather significant recent insider breach? Another proposition, that the government's own protective genius, you've all heard of this, I hope, the Einstein network monitoring tool, it must not work. Because if it did work, surely the government would have shared it with the private sector so that all of our networks would be equally safe and malicious traffic would be stopped and deterred. And that the Snowden effect and concerns over privacy are inhibiting information sharing, network monitoring that could, in fact, lead to more effective cybersecurity. And then finally, in the, notwithstanding the good news we hear about Congress and the bipartisan action, that there has been to date a bit of a lack of an actionable consensus in Congress. We have bills passed in both chambers, to be sure, but we don't have a law enacted, and that in the absence of an actionable consensus on cybersecurity in Congress, that the responsibility of the government for what President Obama has described as the greatest threat to American economic prosperity will continue to remain murky and diffuse. So at least some of those, I hope, are controversial in at least some quarters. So, Michael Daniel, from the White House, does the White House have a responsibility for coordinating the players and making policy for the entire federal government, at least? Are you looking for companies to develop an attestation framework or an attestation response to the frameworks that you do issue on a coordinated basis, like the NIST framework? And are there specific examples of what you're looking for in information sharing and in the public-private partnership that doesn't involve regulation?
Sure. So I think that when you look at what my job is across the government, is really trying to get the whole of government brought to bear on this problem. And what makes cybersecurity, as I mentioned, it's a pretty hard problem. And part of what makes it that hard is it's not one thing. It's not just a threat to our critical infrastructure. It's also a crime. It's also, in some cases, a threat to our critical infrastructure, a crime, and a national security threat. And it also harms consumers. And. It's a big and. And so what that means is that we need all of the tools that the government has in order to address the problem. The problem is not something that any one element of the federal government can solve. And frankly, it's not even a problem that the federal government alone can solve. We actually need to be in partnership with the private sector, and we need to be working with other countries around the world, and we need to be working with our state and local partners. I think when it comes to the framework and the specific question that you asked about the framework, I think that we're not so much interested in particular attestations of, a good lawyer word, of how the framework is being employed, but just that we are concerned that it's actually being used. And the feedback that we actually want from companies, and there's a program at DHS to do this, what we want is, how are you using it? We'd like to know, but on a voluntary basis, but how are you using it? In what ways are you using it? And in fact, actually, I will consider it a huge advantage of the framework when companies start figuring out ways of using the framework that we never even dreamed of when we were putting it together. It's that kind of innovation that we actually want to see come out of the framework. And I think the fundamental thing, if you actually look at what makes the framework functional, is it actually starts to put the cybersecurity problem into a different category. Because cybersecurity is not inherently a technology problem. It's an economics and a psychology problem. And what the framework does is it starts putting it into that language so that you can actually start thinking about it as a company, as an organization, from not just the technology standpoint, but also how does the human factors come into this, and how do you actually manage cybersecurity as a risk, like all the other risks as an organization that you have to manage. Ultimately, where I think we need to go in terms of making the problem more tractable is we need to actually start making certain things that we know from economics and psychology actually start working for us rather than against us in cybersecurity. How do we make our natural human laziness actually work for us rather than against us in cybersecurity? We've learned in, for example, human resource management that if you have an opt-in system for retirement systems, you get a 45 or 50% take rate. If you have an opt-out, you get some crazy, ridiculous number like 90, 95%. Why? Because people are just too damn lazy to opt out of the retirement system. We need to make our cybersecurity much more opt-out. So you actually have to work at being insecure in cyberspace. Lastly, to take the issue of the information sharing that you raised, I think that what we have really started to look at if I polled this room of 100 people, we would probably get about 150 different opinions about what makes good information sharing. And I think that the challenge that I see now is that we've all agreed that more information sharing is good. the hard problem that we actually are facing now is actually getting down to the brass tacks of what pieces of information do we want to move between the private sector and the government, back and forth. What does that actually look like down to the data field? And what are the implications for privacy and other issues like that? And how do you actually manage to move the relevant information that's actually actionable on the part of companies like Craig's, that they can actually do something with and at a speed that actually matters to them, and do it in a way that is protective of privacy and civil liberties, as well as the government's sources and methods for how we got that information upon occasion. And I think those are the conversations that we're now actually finally getting down to having, and that's how we're actually going to make some progress in that information sharing space.
Is that modality for sharing, is that NKIC, or is Suzanne going to tell us about how you're setting that up?
Well, I think she will. I think some of that is going to, a lot of that will flow through DHS. Some of it will also flow through the sector-specific agencies and other kinds of partnerships as well.
Before we go to Suzanne, anybody else on the panel want to comment on Michael's points there? Okay, so Suzanne, do you agree with my proposition that it's the government's responsibility to protect the public and the citizenry from the cybersecurity risk? And the Constitution talks about providing for the common defense and general welfare. What should the public's expectations of the government be here? And is DHS involved in kind of working outreach to the private sector? I think the figure used was 85% critical infrastructure, and even those companies that are not in critical infrastructure, right, who are involved in the point of sale attacks or have consumer data that Julie Brill will talk about. But are you reaching out to them, and do you have effective relationships? You said you have strong relationships. What are the modalities for interacting?
Yeah, great. So first of all, to clarify with respect to the scope of critical infrastructure, point of sale issues and issues across the financial services sector, that is part of critical infrastructure. It's not just roads and bridges, it's not just assets and buildings, it is networks and systems. It is all of those things that underlie our ways of life. And it is about their functionality. So that includes your ability to rely upon those services, those goods and services, your ability to navigate the internet feeling safe and secure just as much as it is your ability to go to a sporting event in a stadium and feel safe and secure. So it is really much broader when we talk about critical infrastructure than people think. It is not a set list. It will vary. What's critical will vary depending on what's happening. And in a Superstorm Sandy, different things become critical that maybe aren't critical in steady state. So it is much broader than people think. Absolutely, the government has a responsibility to do everything that it can to protect its citizens and to help protect companies. But you made the analogy to ordinary crime. And I think it's not it's a useful thing to think about. Absolutely, your local law enforcement has a role in trying to reduce crime in your neighborhood. But you also have a responsibility to keep your doors locked. And it is particularly if you are offering a service, if you're running a storage facility, you're saying to people, you can come and store your goods in my storage facility, and then you don't put locks on the doors of your facility. You bear some responsibility there. And so again, I think a number of us have talked about the importance of being granular when we talk about cybersecurity, the fact that it's not all one thing, right? So we all bring different comparative advantages, which is how I like to begin that conversation about the role of government, the role of the private sector, and the role of citizens. Rather than just sort of starting with what are each of the areas' responsibility, start with what are our comparative advantages that we bring to this. And again, it will vary depending on whether you're talking about, PII theft is the direct analogy to you are offering your services as a storage facility, right? You are storing consumer data. You have a responsibility to take some basic steps to protect that. Intellectual property theft, to my mind, the government has less of a role there directly in terms of vis-a-vis the companies. Companies have the obligation to do their own risk analysis and assess the return on investment. What is it worth to me to protect that intellectual property? A big part of what DHS is doing is trying to drive the market to make sure people understand. So I'll talk in a minute about the ways in which we do outreach and try to inform those risk management decisions, which is really a huge part of what we're about, helping people make smarter risk management decisions. But at the end of the day, it's your decision how much it's worth to you to protect that intellectual property. And we're working with venture capitalists to say, if you're investing in a company, and you're not ensuring that that company whose intellectual property you're buying has adequate cybersecurity, that intellectual property is going right out the back door, and you're throwing your money down a rat hole, and trying to get the market to drive that. I'm working with the American Bar Association. I'm a lawyer in recovery as well. I'm working with the American Bar Association to say, you're lawyers who are engaged in due diligence for transactional activity, mergers and acquisitions. You're doing due diligence, looking at the risks inherent in that transaction. If you're not assessing the risks of cybersecurity, from cybersecurity, and assessing the cybersecurity posture of the company that your client's about to link up with, you are also not doing your job. To auditors, the same sort of thing. So there is a role that we can play in driving the market, but ultimately intellectual property theft is a market issue. And there may be an aggregate cost to the nation that is not adequately reflected in any one company's view. In that way, it's a lot like kidnapping or piracy. There's a national interest that may exceed any one company's interest, and that's something we need to think about. And clearly, we have a role to play in working at the international level to establish norms of behavior, and we are doing that very aggressively with regard to intellectual property theft, making it clear that that is different from nation-state normal kinds of national security espionage. Because of the global marketplace, it is very important that we have an understanding that companies who engage in the international marketplace want to be on a level playing field, don't steal intellectual property, and don't allow companies within there to steal intellectual property. And then there's a different set of threats and concepts around destructive attacks, right? That's not the same as theft of PII, and it's not the same as theft of IP. And by destructive, I mean not just the Saudi Aramco turning 30,000 computers into bricks, but also challenging the reliability of data, right? And that's a whole nother area where, again, I think the government and the private sector do have to come together in a much more collaborative way to understand those threats and to defeat them and meet that challenge. I think we make a mistake. Alan, you threw out a lot of stuff out there provocative. I think we make a mistake, and we are guilty of this. We go out and talk about there are two kinds of companies in this world, those who know they've been hacked and those who haven't discovered it yet, right? And that sends the message that there's nothing you can do. And that is not accurate. Time and time again, studies have shown that about 90% of the intrusions that we see today could be prevented with basic cyber hygiene. There's a lot you can do. We have to distinguish, again, we have to be more granular between those kinds of intrusions and breaches and the advanced persistent threat, nation state kind of actor, very sophisticated player. That you have to identify what it is you're trying to protect. You've got to take basic steps to protect that. And then you have to assume if you've got information that you think a sophisticated actor may want to get at, you have to assume that you'll have an intrusion. And you've got to then focus on detecting it quickly, mitigating the consequences, and recovering. So those are very important.
Well, you definitely give as good as you get. That's for sure. Would it be fair to say that, would you accept the characterization, you've made a little news there in saying that point-of-sale systems are critical infrastructure and that IP is primarily the market-based protective response, less so for the government?
Well, again, yes, point of sale is part of, the financial sector is part of critical infrastructure. It's one of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. I don't think that's news. And again, with IP theft, if you go back to the cybersecurity framework, one of the things that's most useful is it gives you a basic way of talking about this. The first step is identify those assets that you need to protect.
Are you able to tell us whether Einstein works, or would you then have to kill us?
Einstein is very effective at what Einstein is developed to do. Einstein is for the .gov. So DHS has the lead for the civilian .gov systems and networks, and a leading role in coordinating efforts with regard to .com. We have much more leeway with regard to .gov because we have government employees, all have banners on their machines, and so the privacy issues are easier to deal with in the .gov realm. So we can't wholesale just take Einstein and put it in the .com world. We can and do take the data that we get from Einstein and try to use it on behalf of, to benefit the .com. It informs our mitigation alerts and threat information that we get out. We have taken what we've learned from our .gov protection and created enhanced cybersecurity services, which is our way of providing sensitive government information to those who are cybersecurity providers and can protect that information and promise to use it in ways that make their private sector folks more safer. So we are, in fact, getting that information and that technology in appropriate ways out to the private sector.
Great. Well, Julie, DHS has certainly served up for you a very nice segue. About 90% of breaches can be prevented.
I loved that.
Yeah, the responsibility of the private sector to protect themselves. The FTC has really been the federal agency enforcing cybersecurity, where consumer information, personal information has been involved. Is it your view that companies are really not doing enough? And we've talked a little bit about before, and I mentioned at the outset the Wall Street Journal editorial that I had nothing to do with placing. I wish I were that good. Get that out today. Do you think that there is a tension there in terms of the companies that are the victims of intentional wrongdoing, indeed of crimes, being targeted for investigations? And you did mention the piece of good news that you mentioned, which I couldn't read my own handwriting, but you know that in fact the Federal Trade Commission is reasonable about the cases that it brings after doing investigations. If you weren't doing this work, investigating companies, who would be doing it?
Right. So let me take those one at a time. And yes, I very much appreciated the segue you've given me, so thank you. On some level, I think there's much more that certain sectors of industry could do, not only just dealing with the, 90% of the breaches could have been dealt with through fairly simple, low-key types of measures, but also a few other things that I think industry could do. And yet I also think there's some really cool things that industry is doing. So I want to try to highlight both of those very quickly. And then I'll move on to the victimization. And I also want to answer Barron's tweet, which already came out, about why we don't do no action letters, because I think that I want to just get to that too. So I follow Twitter.
Wow.
Yes, we can use
Talk
social
about
media.
multitasking.
Yeah, I'm up here multitasking totally. So really briefly, some of the things industry could do. I have to say that in this day and age, it's really remarkable that the United States has not completely moved to pin and chip. It just should be done. It should have been done already. We are way behind the Europeans. I think it wouldn't solve all breaches, but it would help to a great extent. Now, I realize industry is trying to move in that direction. I worry about the slow roll of this. I think 2015 is too far away. Now, having said that about pin and chip, some of the entities that have suffered serious breaches are moving in that direction. Target has announced that. Walmart, which there's been no serious breach that has ever been announced with respect to Walmart. They have said they're going to move in this direction. So some companies are taking this issue very seriously. I think, to the extent that I have any kind of bully pulpit here, to the extent that anyone's listening out there, I really think that it is long past due for industry, the retailers, the banks, and others to figure out how this is going to be paid for and to get it done. it is harmful to consumers. I mean, that Michael finally mentioned consumers, and I so appreciated that. We have got to start focusing on the harms, not just to businesses, because this is harmful to businesses, but also the harm to consumers. The other thing that I would like to see happen in industry is a greater focus within the C-suite, and I think you also mentioned this too. And Michael and I chatted about this last night. We really need to get data security into the realm of risk management for companies. Frankly, I think we need to get privacy in the realm of risk management for companies so that it's not something that's dealt with way down in the corporate structure by CTOs and CPOs who have to then report up, blah, blah, blah. It really needs to become an issue that is fundamental to the risks that companies face and therefore becomes a critical component of the conversation within C-suites. I think that is starting to happen, but I think we need to see much more of that. Now, another thing that I wanted to mention since we're talking about security, and this is sort of the good news of what companies are doing, and this is just one example of many. There's probably other examples that people here will be able to bring to the fore. But I was very pleased to see that one of the major search engines, why am I being coy? Google has said that it will start ranking websites in part based upon whether they are using the HTTPS protocol. Now, what does that mean? That means that Google is sending a market message to all of the internet, everyone who runs a website, that part of where you're going to be ranked, where consumers are going to see you, is going to be based on whether you are using a more secure protocol. That is such a wonderful nudge or market measure, whatever we want to call it, in this space. And I'd like to see more of those kinds of nudges where companies that do provide a portal, if you will, a bottleneck or a portal, however you want to view it, for consumers into an area where they could be harmed. They're saying those portals will say we're going to look at the security measures of those entities that we are giving consumers access to. So I thought that was really really cool. Okay, victimization was, I think, your next question. Look, I think that victimization notion comes from the point of view that, look, the companies that we are proceeding against have been subject of a breach, and criminals have gone after them and penetrated their systems. And yes, that's obviously true. But as was said a moment ago, I mean, it's not. I actually don't analogize it to just leaving your windows open when you know that there are thieves out there, but you've invited into your home all sorts of people. They're your guests. You've invited them in, whether they're using your services or you're storing their data, whatever it is. You've invited them into your home. You know there are beasts out there, whether we want to call them prowlers or bears or whatever. They're out there. They're right outside, right on your front door, right on your back door. You might not be able to see them right now, but you know they're there, and you leave the windows open. You leave the doors unlocked. I mean, those are the kinds of cases we bring. It's a reasonable security, not perfect security. I can't say that enough. That's what we focus on. And the failure to focus on the harm to consumers, I think, is really problematic. We're not just talking about credit card information, where I'm very appreciative of the fact that many banks and other financial services providers not only provide consumers with reimbursement up to the $50 that's in the law, but they'll take a zero harm approach to consumers. That's great. I very much appreciate that. But what about theft of social security numbers? What about theft of health data? What about theft of account passwords? Information about kids, precise geolocation. All of these pieces of data, which are very sensitive, have been identified as sensitive in law or have been identified as sensitive by the FTC. All of these kinds of data are also subject to breaches, and we have brought actions against companies that have failed to secure that kind of data. There's no ability of a company to give that back to a consumer. Once their health information is out, once their precise geolocation information is out, once their information about kids is out, once their social security number has been hacked, it is exceedingly difficult for consumers to try to backtrack and deal with that issue. So I think that's the kind of theft we really need to be focused on when we're talking about who is the victim here. So as much as I respect the Wall Street Journal and love a lot of their reporters, I think they need to try to focus on those kinds of issues and what is happening to consumers with respect to these thefts. Okay, can I briefly answer the tweet that came out? Why don't we do no action letters? Because a couple of other people pinged back and forth on that. think about this. Okay, and just to get the question clear, and I think it's a fair question, and I'm glad Barron's asked it, and I think you've actually asked it before of me. And it's, it's okay, it's okay. I'm not going to duck it. No, I'm going to answer it just as I've answered it many times before. But not everybody has heard it. So that's okay.
Give us a new one this time.
No, the answer is the same. Because, what Barron's getting at is, if we do in fact go after, sorry, let me start over. If in fact there are hundreds of companies that we might think about investigating, and then some subset of those we actually investigate, but it's in the hundreds. And then we only proceed in terms of an enforcement action of some kind or another with respect to a handful of dozens, at this point 53. Why don't we, with respect to all of the others, issue a no action letter? That's Barron's question, in order to let it be known that there are a lot of companies out there that do have reasonable security. And I think it's pretty simple. If you talk to those companies that we have investigated but have not brought an action against, they absolutely do not want this information out. They feel that they would be subject to further hacks. They would become targets in terms of their cybersecurity practices, and it would be much worse for them. And so they're very, very sensitive about that. Not only that, we obviously have laws with respect to the underlying information. We're not, when we get information pursuant to a CID or another kind of formal information request, we can't give that information out. And then finally, I think that some of these companies are quite legitimately concerned about, despite the fact that the information should be good news, that they did have reasonable security, I think that they'd be concerned about sort of the media effect on them and on their stock and mostly their brand and their customers. And I think all these are very legitimate concerns. There are probably a number of companies here that have been subject to investigation. I bet you not one of them will want to raise their hand and identify themselves. And we respect that. It's their news to tell, not our news to tell.
Not being as nimble with you in terms of manipulating my devices while I'm standing up here.
I'll do it for you.
But I would second what you said, that it's unlikely that companies that have had the pleasure of interacting confidentially with the Commission would appreciate being honored as has been suggested.
Okay, but on that point, can I just add one other thing? Because you and I chatted about this too. Our staff is so incredibly professional. And you mentioned what it's like to get a CID, or what it's like to get that very long information request if you are the subject of a breach and we want to look at what you've done, what the underlying activity was. They might issue a very long communication asking for all sorts of information, but they work very hard with each company to try to get just those pieces of information we need in a layered approach to figure out how far we need to go. They are incredibly professional. I just want to throw that in.
No, absolutely. And I would certainly concur with that, as we talked about earlier. By the way, now you all know if you have any advocacy before the Commission, you've got to tweet it into them, okay? On the C-suite point, Julie,
yes.
I can say that the NIST framework that Michael talked about, which was written in a language that is very accessible to the C-suite, and I would suspect intentionally so, that this was intended to be a lingua franca among non-IT folks, but to move it up the corporate food chain. The SEC guidance back in October 2011 and their subsequent pronouncements, maybe I'll tweet it to you, but I'll also state publicly that the C-suite is really very focused on their obligations and responsibilities on security. Your point on privacy is well taken. Yes, Suzanne.
I just want to pick up on the C-suite issue too. We have been working very closely with CEOs, particularly in the electricity sector, but across a number of critical infrastructure sectors. And one of the things that I love in dealing with the CEOs is that they immediately understand the connection between physical and cyber, and that you cannot look at these in stovepipes. And it is one of the things that I am most passionate about, and that we're trying to make sure that we institutionalize in our approach, but which I think is really important to emphasize. You cannot have your cyber ninjas be the only ones who are thinking about the risks to your business, even just the only ones thinking about the risks to your business that come in through a cyber vector. Because your cyber and your physical security are really inextricably intertwined, and your CSO needs to be sitting down with your CISO, both in terms of thinking about what assets are at risk, because a lot of your physical security assets are networked, your surveillance cameras, your access control systems, your HVAC systems, et cetera, all present vulnerabilities through cyber attack. But also in looking at consequences, you need to understand the physical consequences, and we've set up a team to do that. And on mitigation, perhaps most importantly. We've seen in some instances where the most effective, cost-effective return on investment mitigation for a potential cyber threat is to put in a hand crank. That physical redundancy can sometimes be a significant part of your overall risk management portfolio and picture, even with regard to cyber. So you have to look at these as one, and CEOs across the country really do get that.
The hand crank. I knew there was a role for me somewhere in this
There you
process.
go. There you go.
Yes, Julie, we want to make this interactive.
I just want to
then we'll
follow
get to
up
Craig.
on
Yeah.
one.
Go ahead, Julie.
Okay,
Yes.
really quick. Excuse me. C-suite, yes, there are lots of C-suites that are getting this, and you guys have pointed that out. But I think there are two types of C-suites that I'm now thinking about. One are the mobile app developers. This is a very long tail industry. It's got a lot of little players. We've been working very hard to get them to focus on security. A lot of them are developing some fabulous apps, and some of these apps deal with very sensitive information. So they need to get this message too. And we've run out of water up here. We're having a water emergency. In case you haven't
David
noticed.
Young took care of us.
Yes,
We're all
thank you,
set.
David.
We got refilled.
Okay, so mobile apps, one set of C-suites I'm really worried about. The other is the Internet of Things. And it's those entities that are going to be manufacturing connected dishwashers, connected cars, connected grids, connected everything. Everything's going to be connected pretty soon. In 5 years, if not fewer, we're going to wonder why devices are not connected. And I think that what you have is a whole group of manufacturers who are great at making dishwashers and whatnot, and clothing, whatever it is, but maybe haven't been thinking as much about the security issues. HP just issued a report, Hewlett-Packard just issued a report on the Internet of Things, and found that 90% of connected devices are not using encryption, appropriate encryption. I mean, these are truly, truly remarkable figures. And a vast majority of those, I think it's on the order of 70%, are connecting to other systems. So the Internet of Things brings up a whole slew of security problems, not just about the information that's being collected by the device itself, but then if it's connecting to another network, the vulnerability that is then passed through to that entire network. These are huge problems. We had an Internet of Things workshop several months ago. It was very well attended, and one of the big issues that came up there were all of these issues around security. So I'm very worried and want to send messages to the C-suites with respect to device manufacturers. Those who are not used to thinking about security, they need to be thinking about that front and center. And the Hewlett-Packard report, I recommend it to everybody to read if you're at all thinking about this space.
Sounds like there's the C-suite, and then there's the gentleman's C-suite or gentlelady's C-suite that don't quite do a A-plus job.
Well, no. They just it's just new to them.
Yeah.
It's new to them.
So, Craig, talk about interconnectedness, ISPs. Can you be, are you part of the solution here, bigger part of the problem? I have a feeling you're going to say no to the latter. What do you think about impediments to information sharing? We've talked about that earlier with Michael and with Suzanne. How does it look from your business standpoint, and are there legal constraints that are inhibiting your ability to have visibility into malicious traffic across your networks? What about Snowden? Is that relevant to you? Has that had an impact and privacy concerns on your ability to enhance cybersecurity?
Yep, absolutely. And if you don't mind, a couple prefatory comments. First, Baron, I was listening to everything Julie said, so I was not following you on Twitter. So if you have a question for me, man, I'm right here. So just, but I
can do two things at once.
I'm impressed. I'm just saying I couldn't. And you were so engaged and passionate. I couldn't.
Tom, we need a live feed.
Yes, exactly. What I do wish, though, I wish I had been following Twitter. Just as an aside, Tom, and I have a request. I wish I'd actually been following Harold on Twitter, because I just want to put a pin on something that Julie said was really interesting, which was the shout out on changing search rankings based on cybersecurity, because I think it's very interesting. I think we can all agree cybersecurity is a social good. I would just be interested in how people feel about, I mean, should we change ratings based on environmental records of companies, on diversity records of companies? There's actually an interesting policy debate, I think, packed into there. I'm not saying it's one answer is right or wrong. I just think yeah, you may have a view on what answer is right or wrong, but there's actually an interesting policy debate there on how you do that. And then one of the things, I actually do appreciate the nuance, because I think sometimes, as a company that I can't speak for all companies, but I know certainly at Verizon we do spend an awful lot of time in the C-suite talking about these issues, and I appreciate the differentiation, because there is some umbrage taken sometimes when blanket statements are made saying, you know, C-suites aren't focused on this, whatnot. And I also do want to, I just want to sort of put out there to recognize, and I appreciate Michael's comments on the NIST framework and the way they're approaching it. I want to put out there that there is a little bit of a tension there when people start talking about adopting a NIST framework and the issues around some of the FTC enforcement and the concerns about, is this a gotcha, right? Do you set up a framework, do you say, get people to make a public commitment that says we have adopted this, and then that becomes some sort of liability standard? It's just one of those tensions that I think we need to wrestle through. So should ISPs be doing more? I think there's a technical answer, and I think there's a legal and policy answer, right? So we provide cybersecurity services to a lot of customers, including a lot of very big, sophisticated corporate customers, where we are sitting on their network and looking at things, saying, hey, you've got 5% of your traffic coming in, you know, and more importantly, going to Romania right now. Does that represent 5% of your business? If not, you may have a problem. We're matching up, you know, known threat vectors and signatures against the inbound traffic, right? You're pretty embedded deeply in cooperation with that customer. Certainly the technical capabilities are there to do an awful lot at the network layer. The question, though, that sometimes arises then, if that technical ability is there, should ISPs be doing that more broadly? And that's where you get into legal and policy issues. Clearly, when we are doing this with a customer, you're doing it with their cooperation and, more importantly, their consent. To do that without the customer's direct engagement and consent very quickly runs up into things like wiretap laws, where you're intercepting communications in a way that you simply can't do so. And I think here, and you hearken to the Snowden revelations, and I don't think you ever can get too far into the cybersecurity discussion and talk about information sharing before you have to address the Snowden issue. I think Michael made an allusion earlier to the fact that I think we've all agreed that information sharing is good. I guess I would amend that slightly. I think we all would agree that information sharing enhances cybersecurity. The policy issue we're wrestling with is that the right trade-off? And I think what we're dealing with here fundamentally is an area of crime. And we live in a society, and I think it's inappropriate to frame this as a national security analogy, because I think it is fair for the government to set up an objective to say, part of our role as government, in fact, arguably one of the primary roles of government, is to protect the sovereign territory of the nation state, and that it's a reasonable objective to say we will never have a violation of that sovereign territory. I think that's actually a reasonable and achievable objective. But that's not really the framework I think we should see cybersecurity through. Cybersecurity is much more like a law enforcement problem, and I don't think it's fair to expect government or anyone else to say we will reduce crime to zero. Now, you can reduce crime pretty significantly. I lived in Spain in the mid-'80s, and I constantly heard from people who said, you know, during the Franco era, there was very, very little street crime, and that was true, but there was a trade-off for that, right? I think if each of us had the National Guard camped out in our living room, you know, physical crime would be reduced, but there is a trade-off. And so what we need to wrestle with is not the question of, do you have the technical capability for an ISP to get directly into the network and to win things, but what are the trade-offs we're willing to make as a society? And that's not a decision for ISPs to make, that's a decision for us as a society to make. In the Snowden revelations, what I think has come out loud and clear is, I don't think there's any doubt that enhanced access to information by government enhances national security. That's not the question. The question is, what's the proper balance between privacy and national security, privacy and civil liberties? In this case, the question is, what's the proper balance here? How far do we want to push down cybersecurity, recognizing that there will always be crime in the world? And what trade-offs do we want to make from a policy perspective and as a societal perspective?
Alan, I apologize, but I've actually got to get back to Washington, and because they're closing all of the roads for the bike race, I've actually got to head to the airport. So I apologize to my other
Well, thank you
panelists.
for sharing. We're going to go just a few more minutes? Okay, a few more minutes. So I'm glad you're not leaving in a huff, just leave.
Exactly. Sorry, I
You know,
storm out of it.
I said it would be controversial, and I guess some of us can't take it. Thank you. Thanks. Just in the interest of time, we'll keep moving. Nick, so is Congress the solution here? Is this going to, is it fair to say that this is mired in kind of partisan dysfunction that I've heard said, some people have said, affects certain other issues in Congress right now? Does this apply to cybersecurity? Do you feel, you've got bills that have cleared Senate, there are also bills cleared the House. Is there going to be a meeting of the minds? Shouldn't be a partisan issue, but yet everything these days seems to be, mired in dysfunction, as I say. How has Snowden affected the thinking up there? And do you feel that agencies have the authority that they need to help protect consumers in the case of the FTC? Do you think that more authority is needed there? DHS, is this more authority or more sharing, more cooperation? What do we need to do?
To be clear, we haven't cleared the Senate yet with legislation. It's cleared the relevant committees of jurisdiction. So we're a little behind the House in that regard. The House has actually cleared legislation off the floor. But as I said, it does give me reason for hope because we have several committees with overlapping jurisdiction, all of whom have passed bipartisan bills that have enjoyed strong support from their respective committees. But I think there really are, there are a host of issues as there are with any bills, but probably the two biggest things are this privacy question. Commissioner Brill mentioned it really is in some respects the flip side of the security coin. It's clear in the discussion we've just had about the importance of making that balance the correct one or reaching the right balance. I think the privacy issue is probably one of the biggest sticking points right now, particularly on the information sharing front. You've got a bill that has cleared the Senate Intelligence Committee on a bipartisan vote of 12-3, and yet you've got some very strong reservations voiced by Democratic members of the committee concerning some of the privacy issues. You had the CISPA bill, which passed the House, but drew a veto threat from the administration. There are real questions about whether the House vote would be the same now as it was, pre-Snowden, or whether or not the Snowden revelations would change the dynamics there. You've got the USA Freedom Act that has cleared the House and which is now on the front burner of discussion in the Senate, which might provide an opportunity for folks to actually address some of the NSA surveillance issues in a way that might then make it easier to address cybersecurity. So I think the privacy, coming to grips with the privacy issue, I don't think it's so much a partisan issue at this point as it is it's a thorny issue, and finding the right answer to that is part of the what we're going to need to get to a solution. I think the other thing is you talk about the authority of agencies. You've heard a lot today about risk analysis and sort of risk modeling and understanding risk. You've heard about reasonableness and sort of reasonableness being the sort of factor for determining whether or not there's going to be an enforcement action. Those are things that require a significant amount of sort of case-by-case analysis and circumstantial, what your assets are, what kind of data you hold, what kind of resources you have. Those things do not lend themselves to easily crafted or drafted and prescriptive legislation. And so do I think there's a need for additional authority? I'm not sure that there is. I think that there is a need perhaps for some clarity about some of the existing roles. I think that, in the area of data security and data breach, I think there is growing consensus that a national standard for data breach would be helpful, even if a national standard for data security is not quite there yet. So, I think there are places where we ought to be looking at what is the art of the possible here. And, I have to take some issue with one of the comments that was made on a prior panel. I don't think this is an issue where folks are getting great hay out of saying that they've got a finger in the dike and they're protecting their various constituencies by, saying that this is still a problem that needs to be addressed. I think there is sincere interest on the part of members on both sides of the aisle and in both houses of Congress to actually find a solution here, and I think we will.
Do you think that even if more legislative authority isn't necessary or appropriate, except for, I guess, some of the bills that are going on information sharing, do you think that there's enough? You mentioned privacy as being really a thorny issue and not a partisan issue, but a complicated one. Are you seeing enough leadership on that issue where people are reacting to Snowden? You've got commercial privacy, you've got national security privacy, law enforcement privacy issue. Are you seeing enough coordination out of the executive branch on that front?
Well, you know, we always look for more. But I do think that this is a situation, and unfortunately, I think there's perhaps a missed opportunity on the USA Freedom Act. I mean, it cleared the House, but it came out in a way that, you know, was modified late in the game that drew some opposition from folks who had previously supported the effort. Senator Leahy in the Senate has recently introduced his version of the bill, which has gotten plaudits from folks that previously were upset about the House version. And I know there are a number of supporters of the bill here. But it was negotiated with the administration.
That's on no bulk collection?
This is the ending bulk collection. And it was negotiated with the administration, with a few key senators, and a few key representatives of the privacy and civil liberties community and the tech community. But as far as I know, the ranking members of the committees of jurisdiction, like the Intelligence Committee and the Judiciary Committee, weren't at the table for those discussions. And so we've now been presented with this piece of legislation and told this is a finely tuned, well-balanced, well-crafted piece of legislation, and if you move, you know, one little piece, it's going to lose support. Will you take it? And that's rarely a recipe for getting a bill done in the Senate. So I'm not saying I don't have hope that we can make progress there, because I think there is a lot of interest in doing so. But I think it's going to not be something that can happen in probably the next week or two.
Tom, do we have time for a couple of questions?
One, if they're short.
Okay, 2 short questions. Ed.
Thanks. Hi, Ed Hurst with BlackBerry. I just wanted to follow up on a couple of the comments about government's role in cybersecurity, in particular in the area of mobile. Everybody here has a mobile device, but it's received less attention on cybersecurity. Maybe our government speakers could address the topic of how much of a priority is mobile cybersecurity for the government, how much are you looking at it? NIST has issued rules, there's government rules regarding laptops, but I know Mike has been involved in that, but what's the plan for mobile, and how important is that from the government perspective?
So can I jump in? It's incredibly important. Thank you for raising it. We've actually brought a couple of cases with respect to mobile. For instance, the HTC case involved the hardware provider who had overridden some security provisions or security protocols, and we brought a case in that space. We've also brought cases against Credit Karma and Fandango very recently for failing to guard against well-known man-in-the-middle vulnerabilities. So it's something that we are very much focused on. Again, consumers are moving to mobile. They're putting all their information, including very sensitive information, into mobile, and so we're following where the consumers are going. And you know, with respect to mobile devices and Fitbits and things like that, you know, which are going to start collecting a lot of very sensitive health information, this is also a space that we think that we need to watch. And on this issue of the Internet of Things and mobile, I just want to correct what I said about HP, because I got the data a little wrong, the numbers a little wrong. The HP study, again, which I really recommend to all of you, they found 90% of devices are collecting personal information and 70% are using unencrypted network services. That's a huge, huge amount, whether it's 90% or 70%. It's something that we clearly need to focus on, which is, again, it's sort of part of the mobile space, but that's more particularly on connected devices.
Ed, also going to your point, the Supreme Court actually weighed in on that in the Riley and Lurie cases where the justices acknowledged that one's life is now embedded in one's cell phone. And it was interesting that Chief Justice Roberts there noted that privacy comes at a cost, which is, in that case, was a cost of, constraint on law enforcement, going to Craig's point, and drawing the balance. And those decisions, the Supreme Court said that a warrant was necessary in order to examine the data. Okay, last question. Oh, I'm sorry. think did you have your hand up first? Yes. Go ahead, over here, in front, sorry.
I have a question about the government's process in doing cost-benefit analysis in the cyberspace, particularly with respect to the decision to bring indictments against Chinese hackers, and especially at a time when we have Snowden, with most people in the world thinking the U.S. was using that for our own economic espionage for Petrobras and others. I guess the question would be, what was the cost-benefit analysis that the government went through for that decision, or, as instructive for the future, in the sense that with zero chance of actually getting those hackers to the table, what was the sort of thinking about the potential retaliations in other sectors that government or other governments would do on behalf of what the government did, and sort of how did the government do its own risk analysis there and for the effects of private sector? And I was going to ask that of Mike, but since he's gone, poor Suzanne gets it, and then maybe Craig has thoughts as well.
Right. Well, it's a good question, and it's a shame that Michael's not here. He could give you a fuller answer. But suffice it to say that those discussions took place and that analysis was done. We are asked, and you heard it in Alan's remarks as well, all the time, why can't the government do more to protect us? Why isn't the government doing more to prevent these actors from coming after us and stealing our intellectual property? And law enforcement is a really important deterrent tool that we have, and treating, again, trying to drive home the distinction here. I didn't talk to you about my background, it's in your books, but I spent 20 plus years in the national security world, including a number of years at CIA in the General Counsel's office, and we do not steal intellectual property to benefit our domestic industries. And that is a norm, that is a distinction that we think is important to draw. And so yes, we understand that there are, for every step that we take to try to protect U.S. companies and U.S. infrastructure, there is the potential there. But there, the consensus was that this was an important use of our law enforcement tool and an important message to send.
Craig, last word.
Well, John, there are a number of companies that have dealt in this area quite a lot. I think, this spills over into a whole different area beyond cyber, into national security. And I would simply say, I think that one of the most important things is that we do have a real challenge. I think the genie doesn't go back in the bottle on this post-Snowden. We live in a world where, one, I have to assume that governments don't stop what they're doing. But that everyone now knows what they're doing, and for better or for worse, there is an asymmetry in terms of what the world's view is of what the U.S. does. And so I think the more that the U.S. government can talk about these things, mindful of the global interconnected environment in which we deal, the more helpful it will be. We have been bombarded by stories of many companies who are represented here and others of the impact it's had around the world. And I don't mean that to say, oh, poor pitiful us. It's U.S. companies who are suffering financially from these revelations, but rather a big part of the U.S. government's influence and projection in this area has come from the tremendous global success of companies in the tech sector. And there's a real risk of not recovering that, and a balkanization of the global internet ecosystem as a result of this. So I think it's something that we need to continue to work together on in how we deal with these national security issues between the private sector and the U.S. government.
Very appropriate closing remarks. Thank you, and thanks for everybody's patience. And join me in thanking the panel.